Today we're going to learn about pregnancy tests. These interesting little devices are used to help determine if someone is pregnant. We're really going to be focusing on urine pregnancy tests, like right here. In the big pieces, we're going to learn what these tests test for and how they actually work. So let's get into it. In order to understand how these things work, we have to understand what is it that these tests actually detect. And that is what's called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. Now, as the embryo starts to develop, on a microscopic level, cells start to grow. And within this structure, you have something called a trophoblast. And this is what releases HCG. And HCG is a hormone found in trophoblasts. Now, this structure provides the embryo's nutrients, and in the future will be a large part of the placenta. So this is a very important structure. HCG is released at the beginning of pregnancy. Now let's learn a little bit more and dive a little deeper. So this allows for this structure called the corpus luteum to release what's called progesterone. So let's break that down. Every month during the menstrual cycle, the body goes through these motions. Let's zoom in here and learn a little bit about that. This is very, very basic. Embryology and all this stuff is complicated. Frankly, I wasn't a huge fan of it when I studied it, but that's beside the point. So during the cycle, you have this structure called the primary follicle. Now this little thing will develop over time. This has the egg. As you can see, it's mature, it's a lot bigger here. And eventually it will rupture and release the egg. And then the egg is caught within the fallopian tube and goes on to do its thing. Now, this happens whether or not it is fertilized or not fertilized. Once this structure degrades, it becomes the corpus luteum. It's essentially a natural cyst that forms on the ovaries. And this releases what's called progesterone. Now, I just mentioned that it is an ovarian cyst. Progesterone will then thicken the lining of the uterus, because once the egg implants a fertilized egg, this thickened lining, along with a bunch of other things, will help sustain the fetus as it grows. Now, if the egg is not fertilized, the body's like, oh, well, there's no baby that's going to grow here. Let's shed that thickened lining because we don't need it anymore. Now, this is where the bleeding comes in during the menstrual cycle, along with all the other symptoms caused by a whole bunch of other things. So this is HCG in a nutshell. So let's move on and talk about how these tests actually work. Urine pregnancy tests are very, very interesting. All this stuff I'm going to tell you I didn't really know about, and this is far more fascinating than I actually thought. This is what's called a lateral flow test. This tests the presence of a target substance. These tests are used for all sorts of different things. To detect pregnancy is one of its many, many uses. So let's talk about the mechanism, how this thing works. It's very, very interesting. Just for definitions, it's called a sandwich assay. A really cool part is that this uses gold nanoparticles and antibodies to help this thing function. So let's zoom in and talk about that. So when a urine sample is left on this little device, here's what happens. It gets dropped on this padding. The urine will naturally move up on this assay, on this testing strip. There are very specific pieces or compounds on these different pieces of this strip. So let's talk about those. This first mix area has those gold nanoparticles on top of an antibody. Now, what is this? The purpose of this is that as the urine moves through this, if there is HCG present, it will kind of hitch a ride on these particles and move to the next level of this test. If HCG is present, it will connect to these HCG antibodies, these structures that are specific for HCG that HCG will connect to. When light bounces off this structure, we see red. We see that red strip, as in right here. Then it will continue to move further down the line. Now, regardless of whether HCG is present, this section is designed to react and turn red. So if someone is not pregnant, this section will not turn red, but this always will. This is the control to determine whether or not the test is working. So that part always shows up red. And when HCG is detected, let me just remove all this stuff. Because of the way this thing is designed, this section turns red because it fits in this structure. This is how these things work. It's very, very ingeniously designed, and it's pretty accurate. So the HCG hitches a ride on this gold nanoparticle. It connects to this structure here, which will cause a reaction and turn it red. And regardless of whether or not HCG is present, this section will turn red as a control. So when you have two red strips, that means HCG is present, and there's a very high likelihood you're pregnant. I don't have time to get into all the specifics, but that's the general idea. Oftentimes, a blood test is done to confirm, and then that will pretty much confirm that you are pregnant. So let's talk about false positives and serum. So what is a false positive? A false positive is when a test reads positive, but it's not actually positive. This can happen due to user error, just user error when it comes to using the test, messing it up, stuff like that. It can also happen in the case of something called a biochemical pregnancy. This is technically a very early miscarriage. The embryo provides HCG, but it doesn't progress into the later stages. I'm assuming there are a lot of factors here. I really didn't get into the details of this, but I wanted to mention it because I thought it was very interesting. Now, HCG can be released without someone being pregnant. This could be caused from cancers, tumors, diseases, all sorts of other things. So let's briefly talk about serum. So when your blood is drawn, if you ever go to a doctor and they spin it, the reason why they're spinning it is because usually they're trying to get the serum. If you've ever been to a plasma bank, then they'll spin it to get plasma. All serum is, in comparison to plasma, is it doesn't have this molecule called fibrinogen. Now, to make a long story short, fibrinogen, through a series of processes, will become something called fibrin. This will allow for blood to clot with an injury and stuff like that. So when the blood is drawn to test for HCG, this gives a very, very specific confirmation that you are pregnant. Let's go back and review what we learned. I know some of it was a little specific, so we'll go back over what we covered. We first talked about HCG, this hormone that's released from trophoblast at the beginning of pregnancy. This allows this structure called the corpus luteum to release progesterone to prepare the uterus for the fetus implanting and thus growing into a baby. We talked about the urine pregnancy test. It's this lateral flow test designed to detect HCG by hitching a ride on this gold particle, traveling down, connecting with these other structures. If it successfully connects, that means HCG is present. We see the color red. And regardless of whether or not HCG is present, we have this section that always turns red as a control, just to let us know that this device is actually working. So when you get two red strips, this is purple, I know, let's make it red, then pregnancy is very, very likely. And if you get one red strip, then you are not pregnant because there's no detectable HCG. And then lastly, we talked about false positive being caused by things like biochemical pregnancy or non-pregnant HCG production and user error. Then we made a very, very quick trip and talked about serum, how it does not contain fibrinogen, and a serum pregnancy test is used to really confirm whether or not HCG is present, which means pregnancy in vast majority of these cases. So that's all I got. I definitely learned a lot about how these tests worked. Once I figured this out, I was like, oh, I really got to make this video because this is really interesting. I hope you guys learned something new, especially those of you who have taken a pregnancy test before. So I hope the next time you see one or think about one, you at least have an idea of how it actually tells you that you're pregnant or not pregnant. So as always, thank you so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.